game industry workers may lose their jobs as this week, as Kotaku reports that employees argued wars to death, and ArenaN were warned today to expect big layoffs. The report is based on a source at the company trusted by Kotaku, and it's not hard to believe given the recent waves of layoffs that have battered the game industry. Just last week an estimated 800 people were cut loose from Activision Blizzard, even as the company reported historic earnings. Where we are is not sustainable, and is not going to set us up for future success, reads an excerpt of an email obtained by Kotaku that Gamasutra, ArenaN's parent company, CEO Song Yun, reportedly sent to employees today. The restructuring, cost-cutting, and the strategic realignments are all being done to secure our tomorrow, and to provide the foundation that will allow us to grow and acquire. Part of this restructuring effort will reportedly see a soft and ArenaN's publishing divisions merge, though in another excerpt of said email Yun writes that the company plans to cut costs across the organization. As Kotaku points out, Gamasutra has been cutting back for some time. Last year it shut down struggling world startup Carbine Studios, and this year it laid off staff at its noble Dead Iron Tiger Studios. Gamasutra has reached out to ArenaN representatives for further details on what's going on. If you or someone you know is being affected by this, using ANCONTACTGAMASUTRATO tell your story in confidence. When a AAA game manages to represent the existence of LGBT people in some fashion, there are, broadly speaking, two discourses that emerge. The first is a kind of ecstasy that explodes across social media, the kind that makes incredible fan art appear out of nowhere within minutes of an announcement. Celebrations, optimism, memes, and good humor swirl around the game. The second discourse is what lurks in the queer undertow to it all, the bitterness of many LGBT creators about the fact that our work is held to a much higher standard by our own community than the offerings of Ubisoft. BioWare will able to represent queer life as something more than a binary choice in code, more than a mere romance option. And for our troubles often find ourselves picked apart by our own community for problematic issues, all the while enjoying either microscopic profit margins or debt. The discourse around Lady Killer in a Bind was a case in point, albeit too complex to rehash here. This editorial is a fine primer. While criticism is vital to ensure accountability, it's safe to say many queer creators are quietly being used to at how the low effort of major studios is rewarded with adulation and infinite second chances. The Gay Lesbian Alliance Against the Defamations, GLAAD, statement about the disappointing news concerning Assassin's Creed Odyssey's Shadow Heritage DLC seems to be a case in point. A game which had been praised to the hilt, allowing players to choose Cassandra Alexios' sexuality suddenly forced that character into a storyline where they had to be straight and bear a child. Not only does this invoke all sorts of unpleasant myths about queer people, e.g., homosexuality is a choice, but it also undermines the significance of the choices players made throughout the game. Ubisoft has since leaked the DLC. GLAAD responded. Ubisoft has publicly apologized for the acknowledged mistake, and since last week, GLAAD has been in direct contact with Ubisoft in an effort to work together to improve aspects of this DLC and future content releases. The forthcoming updates to Shadow Heritage, announced by Ubisoft just yesterday, are a positive step, and we applaud them for working to mitigate the damage. The changes do not entirely solve the challenge, but we believe those changes are a good faith effort and a solid first step. Blood thanks Ubisoft for their apology and their commitment to do better. Having worked in the non-profit world in the past, I understand the need to be conciliatory and constructive. You have to give stakeholders a way out, and you have to give them clear, achievable deliverables when you are trying to get them to effect change. I am not especially peeved at them for any of this. Ubisoft is, at least, taking steps in the right direction, especially in the current climate, where the human rights of LGBT people are under constant threat of being rolled back. There has to be some care given to how one portrays such things. We cannot pretend that our pop culture is totally walled off and separate from everything else happening in the world. But beyond all that is the question of why this sort of thing happened in the first place. It was, after all, the easiest thing in the world to avoid. The narrative demand behind the original iteration of the legacy of the first Blade Shadow Heritage DLC was that the bloodline of the Lexios Cassandra had to be preserved. That thread of lineage that went through the many centuries and bases of Assassin's Creed. In ancient Greece, the only way to produce offspring would be the most old-fashioned way there is. Thus the baby-making must occur. It seems simple enough, yet it's equally simple to imagine alternatives here. Queer surrogacy is a thing. After all, countless gay and lesbian parents have used surrogates to bear biologically related offspring that, to uses no technology more advanced than a political marriage of convenience. Meanwhile, for the sole purpose of producing heirs, would also hardly have been out of line as a story worth telling. It's the sort of thing that clear indie writers and devs would be thought of straight away. After all, the forced romance with Nautokos is laden with noxious implications for a Cassandra. The notion that an adventurous woman can only find true fulfillment by settling down with a family and a straight husband at that, and that queerness can be willed away. The shoehorning of this storyline with Nautokos Nima is also, as these sorts of things often are, a matter of weak storytelling. In a game defined by choice, by the customization of the player character's personality, it railroads them into a very specific tale, where all the choices have been made for them. That, of course, points to one of the oldest struggles with these types of RPGs, which itself traces back to the dilemma countless engine masters have faced at their game tables for years. How do you balance the agency of your players with the need to tell a coherent story? Dragon Age Inquisition suffered from this as well. For all the panoply of recorded choices from its two predecessors, and all the hype about the keep, there could only be so many permutations of Dragon Age Inquisition story. It would have been both a literary mess and an impossible mountain of code otherwise. But there is always a way to compromise, and players have to feel like their choices are meaningful. If they played their Cassandra as an adventurous lesbian who spawns domestic life, that should be reflected in DLC like Shadow Heritage, even with the narrative constraint imposed by the law itself, one that strikes me as unnecessary, considering the windless sci-fi weirdness of how other entries in the franchise dealt with this same lineage question. There were ways to do this that did not undermine her character. If Cassandra has to make a sacrifice, so be it. That in itself could be compelling in its pathos. But magically transforming her into a cheerfully domestic straight woman was narratively lazy. There are some caveats to be made here. For one, your character can be bi, and that reality is too often effaced both by video games and by queer Hence who see monisexuality as the gold standard. For a player with a specific vision of their Cassandra, Alexios as a bisexual person who yearns to settle down, shadow heritage might not be the worst thing in the world. Beyond that, Greek sexuality bore little resemblance to our own. The sense of hard categories of sexuality is a fairly modern, Western notion that emerged out of 19th century medical discourses. In Greece and Rome, for instance, intimacy between men was defined primarily by who was active and who was passive in a given sexual encounter, with roles and identities shaped by age, caste as much as gender. The Gala of Rome. Our figures like the Chevalier Dion also point to a long history of sex-gender transitions, variously described. Queerness obviously existed, but the labels and identities we now take for granted were not in use. How people understood themselves was simply different. Nevertheless, these complexities cannot excuse what happened in shadow heritage. Instead, they point to more missed opportunities for depth. How fascinating it would be to see some meaningful exploration of the ways Greek queerness in antiquity differed from that of the modern West.